Welcome, students, to week 6 in the course. This week, we'll be discussing how to use non-test assessments to identify and assess gifted students. We're going to be discussing several types: creativity assessments, portfolios, products, and performance-based assessments. So what are we going to discuss? Today we're going to talk about what does it mean to use a non-test assessment and how may you use them? What are the two ways you can use them? And as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing creativity measures, how to assess performance, how to assess students' products, and how to collect student work through portfolios. So first off, what do we mean by non-test assessment? Well, this is when we use methods other than traditional achievement or aptitude tests. So we're not using, for example, a reading achievement test. We're not using an IQ test. We're using non-test assessments. Regular tests can create problems, especially for underrepresented students. And the reason this exists is manifold. For example, these students may have more anxiety than usual. They might not be as fluent in one particular language, and so that might represent a disadvantage if you're using traditional tests. Non-test assessments are a nice way around that. Non-test assessments may diminish test anxiety and allow students to demonstrate a wider range of abilities. So how could you use them? Well, two ways. You could use them in the gifted identification process, usually in stage 2. Remember, you'll recall that stage 1 was nomination or universal screening, and stage 2 focuses more on information gathering. So this is typically done when when a teacher has noticed that a child might demonstrate higher than average abilities, or that there might be a universal screening that just where they discover that the child is scoring in the top, say, 10% of the school. And then the teacher may be asked to implement some of these non-test assessments as a way of supplementing the gifted identification process. But they are also used in gifted programs to demonstrate mastery of skills or knowledge. So let's say a child goes off to a resource room and does enrichment activities. A gifted teacher might decide to keep a portfolio to demonstrate that students have mastered a certain skill. So first, let's talk about creativity. We know that creativity is going down with the advent of standardized testing, and this has been a change over the last 10 to 15 years in the United States. Children were always the most creative, and we know that because large numbers of students, have been given a test that we're going to look at briefly called the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking. And those scores always held constant until uh, the domination of standardized testing when they started to decline. Whatever you think about creativity, we do know that in all fields of endeavor, outstanding success requires the demonstration of creativity. And this was a statement by E. Paul Torrance in 1962. He was a gifted researcher himself and did a lot of work in the field of creativity. And if you think about it, it really is true. We know that writers need to be creative. We know that artists, those are the usual ones we think about, musicians, but everyday jobs, teachers need to be creative. For example, they're creative in coming up with with lesson plans. They're creative in understanding how to respond to students. Every field requires creativity. And in gifted students, it's especially important because creativity has the ability to turn giftedness into eminence. So, what could be a regular idea, just turned slightly, could become a truly wonderful idea that could change even the world. So, creativity is a powerful and important skill to develop in children. We know we should assess and develop creative potential. because we know that the most developed countries are moving towards a knowledge economy. And this is through innovation or creativity. Think about it. The highest paying jobs today are jobs which require that computers can't do. They're jobs that require skill and creativity. Um, a report from the National Center on Education and Economy said we must change our curriculum to compete in global economy. Critical and creative thinking are crucial for children to find employment in the future. As we move more towards an information age, or more into it, I should say, um, those those jobs that can be done automatically and through automation are slowly disappearing. But the jobs that require creativity and originality are the jobs that are sustaining and even expanding in scope. Teachers need to become more well versed in characteristics of highly creative students. Students who generate a lot of ideas, students who come up with original ideas. Teachers sometimes misidentify creative students as having a behavioral or mental disorder, and this has been infamous throughout history. Some of our greatest, most creatively, potentially creative students have been misidentified as having a disorder, a mental disorder. So, for example, if you have students who are energetic and dreamy, but are also loners, sometimes they're seen as having ADD or ADHD because of their activity level and attention and impulsivity. Some famous examples of individuals that you might recognize went on to become extremely creative and successful are on the left, and some of the common complaints that teachers said that they were guilty of are on the right. Daydreaming, disruptive, constant talker, too energetic, unconventional. It's important to start taking some of these children that we label as behavior problems and flipping that problem on its head and say, is that really a behavior disorder, or are they different, qualitatively different? Are they seeing the world in a different way? What strengths do those children have that they bring to the table that I could use to teach them? So, how do you go about assessing creative potential? Before we talk in depth about the tools, let's talk a little bit about the threshold theory. And that is this idea that above a critical IQ level of 120, there is no correlation between measured creativity and intelligence. So, what that means is you'll recall that a mean IQ, the mean population IQ, is about 100. The average IQ is about 100. So, if you go up, if you keep going up from about 100 to 120, you do see that as individuals' IQ increases, their creativity levels tend to increase. But once you get about 120, that effect diminishes. So if you get to 130, an individual with 140 won't necessarily be more creative than an individual with an IQ of about 120. And that's why many studies have been conducted and show that creative potential is fairly independent of IQ. They're not the same thing at all. So if you only measure IQ, you're missing a good number of students who might be creative. Intelligence and achievement tests alone miss 70% of the top 20% of creative students. If you can find measures that or assess predictors of creative activity, like divergent thinking tests and creative inventories, um, you can generally have some measure of how creative a child is. Paul Torrance came up with a test called the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking, TTCT for short. And this is a test that's a good predictor of adult creative performance. Now, it's based on the concept that creativity has four constructs. Fluidity is the ability to think of many ideas. So a child that you can say, can you come up with 10 words for the color red? And they're able to say magenta and crimson and flame and all of these different words. That might be a child that's demonstrating fluidity. Flexibility is the idea that you can take an idea and to turn it into something else. Um, so, for example, if you're thinking about in the early 20th century, an ice box, the ability of the inventor of the refrigerator was that he took the idea of an ice box, which was this box with basically a block of ice at the bottom to keep the food cold, and found out a way to circulate the air from the coldness and turn it into a refrigerator. Originality is the ability to come up with totally new ideas. So if you have a child in your class that can draw a space alien such as you've never seen before, that child might have original creativity. And finally, the elaboration is the ability to extend an idea into something else. So famously, the inventor of the sticky notepad um, once took glue and cut up just a regular notepad of paper, put it on the back, and came up with the idea of a sticky, extending or elaborating on just a notepad with the idea of adding glue and turning it into something else. Elaboration. Now, the TTCT measures these constructs in various ways. One of the nice things about the test is there are really two tests. There's a verbal test and there's a figures test. And what you're seeing before you is part of the figures test. So a child that doesn't speak English well can still take this test because there's no written word that goes along with it. And the way this particular subtest works, this is only one of the subtests, is the child will be told to create an original drawing out of these figures. And so they will go to work, and the kind of slanted M in the uppercase, they might turn that into a bird speaking, fill in the bird around it. Um, Points are awarded for ideas that are more original. So what does that mean, and how do they know what's original? Well, researchers have given these tests to uh, tens of thousands of children, so they know the kinds of drawings that most children draw, and let's say most children would draw a bird speak on the top left M, and so that would get fewer points for originality than someone who incorporated it into, oh, I don't know, a picture of a pond. And so they draw these pictures and they get scored for originality, for elaboration, and for the constructs that we were seeing before. There are other parts of this test, but basically it's a way to assess students' creativity and come up with a score. Moving on for creativity, another non-test commonly used is called the performance-based assessment. So performance, if you think of the word performance, that means to perform or do something. So performance assessments assess a task or a product. They measure students' abilities to authentically demonstrate knowledge, skills, and processes in a way that provides value, interest, and motivation. So if you ask a student to write a paper, that's different than having them circle true false on a test because they're having to, in a sense, perform or show their skill at writing. If you ask them to dance, similarly, that's different. To write a piece of music, to act, to solve problems, to conduct experiments. Basically, anything that is not just taking a test where they have to do something or demonstrate in some way by taking steps some knowledge, that's a performance task. And they're measured with performance assessments. Performance tasks and performance-based assessments provide for an alternative way of looking at student ability. So they use manipulatives often, that sometimes they'll lack emphasis on speed. So you're not saying, write this piece of music in 2 minutes, for example, or write this paper in 2 minutes. So because the speed element is removed, instead of a time test, students are allowed to think and to reflect and to really be able to show what they're capable of. Underrepresented students do better on performance-based tasks and assessments. And so this sort of allows for the disparities to be reduced between groups. Now, as you might imagine, performance-based assessments can be costly. They can be subjective, so you have problems with rater reliability. Often they're assessed with a rubric, and you might score the rubric differently than I might score the rubric. And there's a big time element, because think about it. Which would take less time, grading a true-false test or a multiple choice test, or scoring a student's project using a rubric? If you've ever done any scoring using a rubric, you'll know that the rubric is much more time consuming and subjective. Summative product assessments are also good ways to assess gifted students. And what are summative products? Well, they're products that students produce after instruction to demonstrate mastery. So let's say you taught a unit in your gifted class on colonial America, and you hold a colonial America day and you ask students to dress up in colonial America costumes and create a poster and bring food in. That might be a summative product. It's not just a paper pencil test. They're usually assessed like the performance-based task with some type of checklist, rating scale, or rubric. As a matter of fact, there is a great deal of overlap between performance-based assessments and summative product assessments. The only difference really being that summative product assessments are always given at the end of instruction and designed to measure learning. These assessments allow for evaluation of a product and therefore students' knowledge and skill level. And something else, they allow for more authentic work. So what does that word mean? It means that students are able to do their work as if they were more like practitioners instead of students. So for example, if you have your students complete an archaeological dig by the side of the school, and they use actual tools that archaeologists might use, that might be called an authentic product. I used to do this with my class, where I would seed I would take a plot of land and tear up the grass and seed it with little fake artifacts, and students would have to diagram it off and use actual products to sift through the sand and to dust off their findings. So authentic means they're actually working like real practitioners. If they're writing, they study the works of authors and they write and model their writing like they're real practitioners. If they're scientists in elementary school, this is a fun thing to do with kids. Get them little lab coats and call them scientists and have them go through the practices that an actual scientist might use in a laboratory. So these summative product assessments, and also, by the way, performance-based assessments, both allow for more authentic work. Just like with performance-based assessments, summative assessments often are scored using rubrics, sometimes using checklists and rating scales, but often rubrics. Rubrics frequently consider the product's effectiveness. So a rubric might answer the problem questions, has the problem been solved? What's the level of quality? It might assess the process the students use and the skills. Rubrics need to ask if the product is authentic, if it's elegant, is it efficient, is it original, neat, organized, and well designed. And there's a whole course that could be taught on designing rubrics. But I'm sure that many of you have used rubrics and know what a rubric is. This week, you're going to be asked to use an assessment form called the Student Product Assessment Form, or SPAF for short. This is a form that may be used to rate a student product, and you're going to look at a picture of a student product and read about how the student came up with this idea, and you're going to rate that product using this form. Another way to assess students, gifted students, either in the identification process or as part of the gifted curriculum, is to use, just like regular classroom teachers, portfolios. And this is a collection of student work, either over a brief time or throughout the year. Some teachers even maintain portfolios on the child and pass them from teacher to teacher as the student goes up a grade. 4 types are generally known: celebration, celebrate students' accomplishments; competence, documents mastery; growth, documents growth over a period of time. So a teacher might start a portfolio at the beginning of the year and keep that portfolio going until the end of the year. Project portfolio, so if you're teaching one particular unit, let's say that Colonial America unit, a project portfolio might contain only the work for that one unit. When you're doing portfolios, it's important to, to involve the students in the development of the portfolio and the selection of materials. So that creates a sense of student ownership. So you're going to talk to the students about what their portfolios might contain. You're going to probably have some predetermination of the kinds of things you want to see in there. But you're going to meet with students one-on-one and help them select work. You might do a weekly conference with a student and have them select work, their best work, or maybe sometimes not their best work, so they can demonstrate mastery. Collect and store that in some organized way. You have to have some evaluation criteria, and portfolios are often assessed again with a rubric. It's good to use this rubric to ask students while you're conferencing to have them evaluate their own work and to conduct these regular systematic portfolio conferences. When you develop a rubric for a portfolio, it's good to know that skills or knowledge should be significant and related to whatever standards you're teaching, either in the gifted program or in the regular classroom. For gifted students, this can be a real way to raise the ceiling and allow them to demonstrate what they can do. So the bar should be high. So if you know a student is a great writer, one of the rows on your rubric can be that they demonstrate the top level of their skill ability, and to expect a little more out of them than maybe a student whose strengths might be in other areas. Of course, it goes without saying that all skills and our knowledge assessed should be taught. This is a common error I see with teachers where they think a child is gifted and so they just know the information, but that's not necessarily true if they haven't been taught. Don't overload the rubric. Don't use a lot of criteria. Don't use a rubric that has 50 rows. 4 to 7 work well. And it should be clear to the student and it should work for you. It should be something that's clear to you. There are lots of examples of rubrics online and how they can be used to assess student work. Some teachers go as far as to create a student rubric in kid-friendly language so that the child will know what it means. Even down as early as kindergarten or first grade, students can be taught to analyze and evaluate their own work with the use of happy faces and things like that on a rubric. Portfolios have a lot of benefits. First of all, it contextualizes assessment. By that, we mean sometimes when we take a test, it just seems to be out there in a vacuum. Kids get very nervous. They don't connect the assessment with the learning. But this happens to be a way to, as they're working through the learning, to have them put aside their assessment papers, whether they be papers or products, and they can then make that connection more strongly between the learning experience and how they're being assessed. It can allow you to gather a wide range of samples from multiple sources. So it's not like a test where a student comes in, if they're having a bad day, they might do poorly on the test, but despite knowing the material. With a portfolio, you really get an opportunity to assess students multiple days across multiple different types of assessments. Again, we said it integrates assessment with instruction and it encourages a deeper understanding of knowledge, partly because we're asking students to consult with us through a portfolio conference. And one of the things we know about retention of knowledge is that students who reflect on their learning are much more likely to retain what they've learned. Students like to be actively engaged, especially gifted students, and this engages them in the assessment process. And it allows individual differences and an alternative to students with special needs, and I'll also add underrepresented students, an opportunity to showcase their abilities. Again, you can use this for identification purposes before students enter a program, and you can also use portfolios once they're in the gifted classroom to demonstrate mastery. Obviously, just like with the PBAs, it's a time challenge. It does take more time than to giving a test. It's subjective because once again, we're evaluating with a rubric. And sometimes you get some competition with high stakes assessment, which means that there's such a focus now on high stakes assessments like standardized tests that many teachers feel unwilling to give up the time despite the many rewards that come from portfolio assessment. So what are some key points we've learned today? We've learned that alternative assessments exist to uncover and assess students' capabilities in a more authentic manner. These assessments are generally more time-consuming and more subjective, but they are much more likely to identify students who might be missed with more traditional measures. They should be methodically planned and implemented throughout the school year. Thank you.